Imagine walking the gray streets of Liverpool on an ordinary day in the 1950s and passing a boy with restless eyes, messy hair, and clothes that hinted at a rebellious streak. Back then, few people would have bet on this defiant young man, whose favorite language was sarcasm. You've probably already guessed. This was John Lennon, a boy with a different kind of soul, marked by loss, by a lack of direction, by chaos. And yet, John Lennon would turn every one of those burdens into creative fuel for something that would conquer the world. The Beatles? Yes, one of the greatest bands in music history would rise from this, a group capable of redefining an entire era's culture and inspiring millions of people. But the legacy John Lennon left behind is anything but simple, both luminous and dark, like an E minor chord in a love song or a beam of sunlight cutting through a dusty window. Beautiful, but never quite pure. So allow me to introduce myself. I'm Brian Emmendorfer, back to another episode of Lost Bones. Today, we're revisiting the most important moments in the life of this musical legend and exploring how John Lennon's assassination transformed him into an unwilling martyr for a generation whose ideals still echo today. The dream of world peace has always lived somewhere deep within humanity's deepest longings. Battered by wars, conflict, and inequality, the idea of a harmonious global society often feels out of reach. And yet, in certain moments, it becomes a cause worth fighting for. It was with that same spirit that great thinkers began their own journeys. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi, who believed in freedom without bloodshed. During his lifetime, the philosophy of nonviolence became a powerful weapon against the British Empire. Instead of rifles, Gandhi wielded fasting, protest, and peaceful marches. In the United States, Martin Luther King raised his voice against the racism and segregation tearing the country apart. But his dream reached beyond civil rights alone. He envisioned a world where children of every skin color could walk together without fear. Martin was killed for that vision. Even so, his message lived on through generations. Decades later in Pakistan, a young girl named Malala Yousafzai stood up to one of the most feared groups on earth, the Taliban. At just 12 years old, she wrote for the BBC, documenting the Taliban's grip on her homeland, the Swat Valley, and defending women's right to education and freedom. For that, she was shot in the head, but survived and went on to become the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Many other names have walked similar paths, but this episode focuses on John Lennon, one of pop culture's most iconic pacifists. John Lennon's career began in Liverpool in 1960, alongside Paul McCartney and George Harrison. With drummer Pete Best joining the lineup, they started playing bars in Hamburg, Germany, where they developed the sound that would give birth to the Beatles. In 1962, under manager Brian Epstein, Pete Best was replaced by Ringo Starr, and the group signed with EMI. That same year, they released Love Me Do, followed by Please Please Me, achieving instant success. The Beatles quickly dominated the British charts and carried their music out into the world. On February 7, 1964, they landed at JFK Airport in New York, greeted by a massive crowd of fans. 2 days later, they performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, roughly 34% of the entire U.S. population at the time. That moment reshaped the course of pop culture entirely. Between 1965 and 1967, the band explored new sounds, releasing psychedelic albums that broke away from traditional rock. But starting in 1967, the group's stability began to crumble. Brian Epstein's death disrupted the band's internal organization, and the following year, John Lennon separated from Cynthia Lennon to begin a new relationship with Yoko Ono. Was an artist devoted to causes of peace and love, ideals John quickly connected with. Her presence didn't sit well with the rest of the band, and tension mounted. John began pouring his life and art into pacifist activism, aligning himself ever more closely with Yoko's philosophy, turning his journey into a cry for change. Around this time, On's activism intensified alongside campus protests against the Vietnam War. These demonstrations, carried out in partnership with Yoko, led to the yet release of his first major solo song, Imagine, in 1971, a track that would become a pacifist anthem. Its lyrics invited listeners to imagine a world without borders, religion, or possessions, the very things fueling inequality. Alongside it, Give Peace a Chance also became a rallying cry for war opponents. Despite its impact, his vision drew criticism. Many argued his approach was too romantic, ignoring the complexity of political, economic, and social conflict. To these critics, peace demanded more than inspiring messages. It required structural change and reconciliation between the interests of nations and groups. On the other hand, defenders of his cause argued that world peace couldn't come from diplomatic agreements alone. It also required a shift in collective mindset. In this view, the pacifism John proposed was essential to sparking any real transformation. That belief was put to the test on December 8, 1980, when John Lennon was approached outside the Dakota building in New York and shot to death. One of the world's greatest symbols of peace was killed by senseless violence. His killer claimed John was a hypocrite, a man who preached peace and love while living surrounded by luxury and distance from ordinary people. John Lennon's death exposed just how deeply violence remains embedded in society, both in the individual psyche and across the collective. And yet, like other pacifist leaders before him, his death inspired thousands, revealing just how far the world still is from the ideal he once imagined. As he sang in Imagine, "You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." So when exactly did this longing for peace begin? Was it with Yoko Ono, with the Beatles, or had it always been part of him? Perhaps the answer will never be entirely clear, but among the many fragments of John's life before fame, there are clues to be found. John Winston Lennon was born on October 9th, 1940, as bombs from the Second World War fell over Liverpool. The only child of Julia Stanley and Alfred Lennon, he was named in honor of his paternal grandfather, John Jack Lennon, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Alfred, an Irish-descended merchant sailor, was absent for his son's birth. In the early years, he sent money home while Julia raised the boy alone. But everything changed in February 1944, when Alfred disappeared. The payments stopped, and he didn't resurface again for 6 months. He tried to reclaim his role as father, found Julia pregnant by another relationship. The situation worried Mimi, Julia's older sister, who twice reported the family's instability to Liverpool social services. Under that pressure, Julia agreed to let Mimi take custody of John. In July 1946, Alfred reappeared and took the boy to Blackpool, planning to bring him to New Zealand for a fresh start. When she noticed him missing, Julia and her partner, Bobby Dykins, tracked the pair down. The reunion ended in conflict, with Alfred forcing his 5-year-old son to choose who he wanted to live with. According to some accounts, the boy chose his father twice, not fully grasping the weight of the decision. But when he saw Julia walking away, he broke down crying and ran toward her, choosing to stay with her instead. More recent accounts, however, dispute this dramatic version of events. Author Mark Lewisone claims Julia and Alfred had actually reached an agreement beforehand, and that the episode wasn't nearly as emotional as it's often described. Whichever version is true, the fact remains, after that day, father and son went their separate ways, not reuniting again for nearly 2 decades. Julia wanted to keep John, but young and unstable herself, she agreed to leave him in the care of Mimi and her husband, George Smith, on Menlove Avenue in the Mendips area. In his new home, John settled into a more stable routine. Mimi, strict and education-focused, filled the house with books and encouraged reading. George, and warm-hearted, worked as a milkman and included John in his hobbies. It was George who gave him his first harmonica and introduced him to crossword puzzles, small gestures that helped shape John's restless, creative mind. Even living with his aunt, John stayed in close contact with Julia. She visited often, but it was time spent at her own home that most shaped John's relationship with music. There, his mother would put on Elvis Presley records, passing along the energy of rock and roll that was beginning to sweep through youth culture. She also picked up the banjo and taught him to play. During this period, John also spent a lot of time with his cousin, Stanley Parks, who frequently took him to the cinema. Their bond deepened during holidays. Stanley would visit alongside Layla Harvey, another relative, and the three of them made regular trips to Blackpool to watch live shows. Blackpool was pure entertainment paradise for John. The group watched the Blackpool Tower Circus and performances by popular entertainers. Of all of them, the one who captivated John most was George Formby, a British comedian and musician, a banjo master with a peculiar sense of humor. Over time, Stanley and Layla's families relocated to Scotland, but the visits continued whenever possible, especially at the Parks family farm in Edinburgh. It was in this setting that John spent unforgettable summers between the ages of 9 and 16, exploring the Scottish countryside. But it wasn't all joy. On June 5, 1955, his uncle George Smith, Mimi's husband and a true father figure to John, died at 52 from a hepatic hemorrhage. The loss hit the boy deeply. Despite the pain, few people noticed, since John was known for being outgoing and quick with a joke. By nature, he was defiant, provoking teachers, getting into fights, disrupting class. This earned him a reputation as both a troublemaker and the class clown. John had always shown a talent for art and humor, overflowed with caricatures, his notebook and comic sketches. His sharp, irreverent wit found an outlet in the Daily Howl, a student magazine he created himself, filled with jokes and satirical illustrations. In 1956, John received a gift that would change his life, his first guitar. His mother, Julia, borrowed £5 and 10 shillings to buy him an instrument, a Galatone Champion, a budget acoustic model made in South Africa during the 1950s. The guitar's body was built from cheap local woods, mahogany and spruce, its neck made from sturdy African maple, with a dark fretboard and simple metal fret finishes. Curiously, John and Julia kept the instrument hidden from Mimi, who saw no future in music. Practical and skeptical, his aunt never believed music could become a real career, even as her nephew's ambitions for fame grew clearer. When Mimi discovered the guitar, she declared the instrument would never put food on the table. And John, determined to prove her wrong, began to change. His teachers were the first to notice the shift. Though they recognized his intelligence and energy, they saw him channeling it into what they considered the wrong direction: music and his own daydreams. Soon after, Mimi noticed the distance growing between them as John dove deeper and deeper into the world of music. At 15, he decided he no longer wanted to just listen to music. He wanted to create it. In September 1956, he founded the Quarrymen, named after Quarrybank, a high school where he studied. The amateur but enthusiastic group blended skiffle with rock and roll influences. Skiffle used improvised instruments, washboards for percussion, tea chests fitted with a broomstick as makeshift bass, spoons and tin cans providing texture. The vocals were raw and spontaneous, something John excelled at effortlessly. By the summer of 1957, the band was already playing small gigs, splitting its repertoire between skiffle and rock. During the group's second performance, on July, at St. Peter's Church Fete in Woolton, John met Paul McCartney. Impressed by the new musician's skill, John invited him to join the band. That meeting marked the beginning of one of the greatest partnerships in music history. Not everyone approved of the friendship, though. Mimi, known for her firm opinions, viewed Paul as coming from a lower social class and treated him with a certain disdain. At the McCartney household, Paul's father was equally wary of John, worried he'd bring trouble. Some of that resistance came from John's rebellious streak and the intense way he related to people. Even so, the McCartney family allowed the group to rehearse in the front room of their home on Forthlin Road, number 20. Not long after, Paul invited 14-year-old George Harrison to take over guitar duties. At first, John hesitated, thinking the boy too young to keep pace with the band. Paul pushed the idea and arranged an impromptu audition. On the top deck of a Liverpool bus, George played raunchy with such skill that he won John over instantly. George joined the group, and things moved quickly from there. Some time later, Stuart Sutcliffe, John's friend from art college, joined as bassist. During this period, John wrote his first song, "Hello, Little Girl." Simple as it was, the composition already showed real promise, confirmed years later in 1963, when the song became a UK hit after being recorded by the band The Foremost, reaching the top 10 on the charts. By that, the band was already outgrowing its skiffle roots, becoming something far bigger. But before that leap, on July 15, 1958, John faced a devastating blow. His mother, Julia, was struck by a car and killed while walking home from visiting her son. She was only 44. The loss hit John hard, at a time when he was still searching for his place in the world. Over the following 2 years, he sank into drinking and fighting, consumed by an intense anger friends described as blind fury. Even so, Julia's memory stayed vividly alive and became one of the greatest inspirations behind his music. Years later, that grief would surface in compositions like Julia, released by the Beatles in 1968, a direct tribute to the mother he lost far too soon. Meanwhile, his school performance suffered. He failed key exams, a setback that could have ended his education altogether. But Mimi and the school's headmaster intervened, securing his admission to Liverpool College of Art. There he found a new environment, but kept his rebellious spirit intact, adopting the teddy boy style, bold clothing, a provocative attitude, which quickly drew attention on campus. His behavior brought frequent trouble, with numerous warnings for conduct outside the norm. It was around this time he met Cynthia Powell, a fellow student at the college. At first, Cynthia wasn't drawn to John's scruffy, rebellious manner. Still, she discovered his fascination with French actress Brigitte Bardot, known for the film And God Created Woman. Bardot was a sex symbol of the era and an advocate for animal rights, embodying a hedonistic, pleasure-centered lifestyle. Noticing his interest, Cynthia dyed her hair blonde, catching John's attention almost immediately. He asked her out. She revealed she was already engaged. Indifferent, John simply replied he'd never said he wanted to marry her. Cynthia was engaged to another young man, considered a solid, respectable match her family approved of, but she chose to break it off to be with John instead. That's how a relationship began that would last for years. Just before completing his final year, John was expelled from the college. From the beginning, it was clear he simply didn't fit within rigid structures, and the education system had no idea how to handle someone like him. It hardly fazed the young man. In early 1960, John, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Stuart Sutcliffe adopted the name that would go down in history, the Beatles. With a clearer identity taking shape, the group began chasing new opportunities, and one arrived that August, a 48-night residency in Hamburg, West Germany. There was just one problem. They had no drummer. With no time to waste, they brought in Pete Best to complete the lineup and lock in the trip. When John told Mimi the plan, she was horrified. To her, the idea sounded reckless, a youthful lapse in judgment, fearing for her nephew's future. She begged him to stay in art school. But John, nearly 20 now, had already made up his mind to carve his own path, and off to Hamburg he went. The experience proved intense, transformative. The band played for hours on end, nearly every night, building stamina and sharpening their stage presence. During these marathon sessions, John and his bandmates discovered preludin, an amphetamine musicians used to power through exhausting sets. John quickly folded it into his routine in the city. Hamburg played a crucial role in the band's evolution. They'd return there twice more, in April 1961 and April 1962. It was in those cramped, smoke-filled clubs that the Beatles began shaping themselves into the musicians who would soon change music history. Over time, Cynthia began visiting John in Hamburg, joined by Paul McCartney's girlfriend. But her relationship with John was far from harmonious. He was intensely jealous, prone to outbursts of rage that frightened her. According to biographies, Cynthia recalled that when John saw her dancing with Stuart Sutcliffe, he physically assaulted her. Traumatized, she ended the relationship. 3 months later, John apologized and begged for reconciliation. Cynthia agreed, and while he never turned physically violent again, he remained verbally cruel. Years later, John would acknowledge this behavior, admitting he'd been abusive, channeling his frustrations onto the women closest to him. That reflection surfaced in the song Getting Better, where he described himself as someone who took everything out on his partners. In mid-1962, after discovering Cynthia was pregnant, the couple decided to marry. The ceremony took place on August 23rd in Liverpool. Brian Epstein, recently hired as the Beatles' manager, served as best man. The honeymoon barely began. On their wedding night, John was already back on stage. In the months that followed, he dove into an intense schedule of shows. Brian, worried about the band's public image, feared that a married Beatle might drive fans away, so he instructed John and Cynthia to keep the marriage secret for as long as possible. On April 8, 1963, Cynthia gave birth to Julian Lennon. John, on tour, didn't meet his son until 3 days later, and despite now having a family, his true commitment remained with the Beatles. When Brian Epstein took over management of the band in 1962, he had no experience in the music industry. Still, he made up for his lack of expertise with sharp strategic vision and strong influence over the group. Brian pushed for a more polished, professional image, which met resistance, especially from John, who disliked the idea of trading his rebellious style for matching suits. He eventually gave in, though. Brian's relationship with the Beatles began in November 1961, during a performance at the Cavern Club. Enchanted by the group, the sophisticated, ambitious manager decided he wanted to represent them. Some biographers have suggested Brian's admiration for John went beyond professional interest. Philip Norman speculated that, as a gay man living discreetly due to the era's prejudices, Brian may have felt genuinely attracted to John. Author Mark Lewison, on the other hand, dismissed this theory, arguing there was no concrete evidence to support it. One curious fact remains. Shortly after Julian's birth, John traveled to Spain with Brian, a trip that fueled speculation about the nature of their relationship. When asked about it, John gave an ambiguous answer. Love affair, but not quite. It was never consummated. John had a sharp sense of humor and enjoyed provoking people, often mocking Brian for being gay and Jewish. As the band solidified its identity, Paul McCartney took over on bass after Stuart Sutcliffe decided to stay behind in Hamburg. Not long after, Pete Best was replaced by Ringo Starr, completing the classic Beatles lineup. Their first major milestone came in October 1962, with Love Me Do reaching 17th on the British charts. But it was on February 11, 1963, that the band truly took a decisive step, entering the studio to record Please Please Me, their debut album, in under 10 hours. Despite battling a cold, John threw himself completely into the final track, Twist and Shout. The strain and effort gave the song a raw, unforgettable energy. The record featured 8 original tracks written by the duo who would come to be known as Lennon-McCartney. At that stage, the songs followed simple, traditional pop formulas with modest ambition. John would later admit that, at the time, the band was writing simply to produce, without worrying too much about content. The words, he said, were almost irrelevant. Paul McCartney would later describe that period as the peak of John's popularity, when he'd essentially become a mini Elvis. But everything would begin to change with the arrival of Yoko Ono. John Lennon met Yoko Ono on November 9, 1966, at the Indica Gallery in London. She was preparing a conceptual art exhibition when she was introduced by John Dunbar, the gallery's owner. John became interested in her piece Hammer a Nail In, which invited visitors to hammer nails into a wooden board. He wanted to take part, but since the exhibition hadn't officially opened yet, Yoko refused. Dunbar argued John was a millionaire. Yoko relented, but asked for 5 shillings in exchange. John replied he'd pay with an imaginary 5 shillings and use an imaginary nail. The playful provocation sparked tension that only deepened when John took a bite out of the apple displayed as part of her piece. Apple. Another of Yoko's installations featured a ladder with a magnifying glass hanging above it. At the top, in tiny letters, was a single word. Yes. According to John, that small affirmation was what made him stay. A positive answer in an otherwise cynical world. From that point on, he began to see Yoko as the girl who'd come to stay. Around this time, John was already using LSD frequently, which affected his relationships, including his marriage to Cynthia, who noticed her husband growing more distant, his behavior shifting. Though he claimed to use LSD for creative purposes, John admitted the experiences ranged wildly, sometimes feeling like a complete failure, other times like an all-powerful god. He was fascinated by altered states of consciousness, even claiming that paranoia was simply expanded awareness. This search for spiritual answers also drew him closer to Yoko. After their first meeting, Yoko began calling John's home regularly. When Cynthia questioned him about it, John claimed Yoko was simply desperate for money to fund her unimportant art projects. The reality, though, was something else entirely. In May 1968, while Cynthia traveled to Greece, John invited Yoko over. Together, they recorded the track Two Virgins and ended up sleeping together. When Cynthia returned, she found Yoko wearing her own robe, sharing tea with John, hurried as though nothing had happened. Without a word, Cynthia left and stayed with friends, feeling deeply humiliated. Weeks later, a friend informed her that John was pursuing a divorce and wanted custody of Julian, their son. To make matters worse, he accused Cynthia of adultery, alleging an affair with Roberto Bassanini, an Italian hotelier, an accusation she denied. After negotiations, John agreed to let Cynthia file for divorce instead, citing infidelity on his part. Outside of court, the matter was November 1968. Cynthia received a lump sum settlement, a modest annual allowance, and custody of Julian. That same month, Yoko, then pregnant with John's child, suffered a miscarriage. Following the turmoil in his personal life, John would soon face conflict within the Beatles as well. Many claim his relationship with Yoko strained his bond with the other members. However, in the book John Lennon, Yoko Ono and Me, journalist Jonathan Cott disputes that narrative. Jonathan first met John while working at Rolling Stone and, thanks to his sensitivity as an interviewer, became one of the few people to earn the musician's trust, particularly in his final years. In the book, written with Yoko's support, Jonathan pulls back the curtain on the Beatles' final chapter. Yoko explains that she and John were so emotionally consumed by one another that they lost touch with the world around them, living, in her words, inside a kind of fog. Even so, Yoko maintains that Paul, George, and Ringo were far too strong-willed to be shaped or influenced by her presence. The band's internal dynamic had already grown fragile long before she entered the picture. The real crisis, she argued, began with Brian Epstein's death in 1967. Without their manager, artistic disagreements and internal conflict intensified. Brian had been the glue holding the band together, giving each member space to share their ideas. Yoko admired the Beatles deeply, comparing the group to a lineup composed of Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, and in her view, it was inevitable that such a group would eventually fall apart. Another important factor, John was struggling with deep emotional instability. Fear, doubt, and anguish weighed on him constantly. Meeting Yoko changed that. According to Jonathan Cott, John believed only Yoko truly understood him completely. He used to say, "I'm the fish, and she's the sea. I'm the apple, and she's the tree. I'm the door, and she's the key." Him as someone in the process of rebuilding himself, and she took on the role of his emotional and spiritual anchor. Jonathan also notes that John willingly gave up his status as a kind of king, having grown tired of being idolized. What he truly wanted was to be vulnerable, authentic. Together, the two decided to turn their love into art and protest. In March of 1969, the couple married and spent their honeymoon at the Hilton Amsterdam, staging their famous Bed In for Peace, a peaceful protest built around a simple message. If everyone stayed in bed instead of killing each other, the world would find peace. The action sparked controversy, but drew heavy media attention, with journalists flocking to the hotel to interview them. John and Yoko wanted to bring the protest to the United States, but a marijuana possession charge barred John from re-entering the country. In response, they staged a second bed-in at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, where they recorded "Give Peace a Chance." It was during this period that the famous phrase, "Make love, not war," took hold, a slogan that later became a song in its own right. John immortalized this chapter of his life on the album The Wedding Album, referenced here as The Ballad of John and Yoko. On April 22nd of that same year, John officially changed his name to John Lennon during a low-key ceremony held on the rooftop of Apple Corps, the record label founded by the Beatles and originally overseen by Brian Epstein. He and Yoko moved into Tittenhurst Park in Ascot. After a car accident involving Yoko, John had a king-size bed brought into Abbey Road Studios, allowing her to stay by his side during recording sessions. The couple remained focused on John's growing solo career. Later that year, in September, during a Beatles business meeting, John announced the band was over, arguing that since he'd started the group, he also had the right to end it. But the breakup only became public the following year, when Paul McCartney announced his own departure. John's debut solo album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, 1970, stunned the world with its raw honesty and emotional intensity. Critics praised the weight of its songwriting, though part of the audience, accustomed to the Beatles' lighter melodies, resisted its rawness. Right from the opening track, Mother, John laid bare the trauma of childhood abandonment without metaphor, just pure pain. In Working Class Hero, heavily influenced by Bob Dylan, he called out the hypocrisy of class divisions, a message so provocative that many radio stations refused to play it. In early 1971, activist Tariq Ali interviewed John and shared radical political ideas that left a strong impression on him. Inspired by their conversation, John wrote "Power to the People," though he later admitted the song came more from a desire to please radical circles than from genuine personal conviction. Around the same time, he became embroiled in a legal controversy stirring up the UK. The magazine Oz was facing an obscenity trial, and John reacted fiercely, calling the charges disgusting fascism. He recorded the single "God Save Us" with Yoko under the name Bill Elliott and the Elastic Oz Band, and joined protests in support of the publication. Without the Beatles softening his public image, John began using his own voice to confront, provoke, and pursue authenticity on his own terms. After the raw intensity of his previous album, he aimed for something more accessible, without sacrificing his core message. That's how Imagine was born in 1971, with contributions from George Harrison. Critics received the album enthusiastically. Rolling Stone praised its musical quality, though it left open the question of whether John's ideals might eventually feel repetitive or out of step with changing times. It didn't take long, though, for the title track to spread across the globe and prove that concern wrong. Imagine transcended music entirely, becoming a true pacifist anthem sung by crowds around the world. Not everything on Imagine carried that same dreamy tone, though. In How Do You Sleep, John took direct aim at Paul McCartney, responding to jabs he believed were hidden within Paul's album, Ram. A few lines were also aimed at Yoko's critics. Another standout was Jealous Guy, where John revealed a rare vulnerability and regret, his gentle voice acknowledging just how harshly he treated the women in his life. It was an apology set to music, arguably one of the most honest moments of his entire career. Behind the scenes of the album, friendships and disagreements intertwined. In gratitude for George Harrison's contribution to the recordings, John accepted an invitation to perform at the Concert for Bangladesh, organized by George. Everything was set, until one of George's conditions changed everything. He didn't want Yoko on stage. That demand sparked a fight between John and Yoko, and John ultimately withdrew from the show. For him, performing without her simply wasn't an option. Not long after, the couple moved to New York in search of greater freedom. They first settled on Bank Street in Greenwich Village. Later, worried about security, they relocated to the Dakota Building, overlooking Central Park. Both John and Yoko saw New York as a vibrant, chaotic city, the perfect backdrop for immersing themselves in America's left-wing political scene. It didn't take long before they began using art as a form of protest. That December, they released the single Happy Xmas, War is Over, a peace message directed against the horrors of the Vietnam War and the Nixon administration. The response came quickly. The White House began viewing John as a threat to public order. Under pressure, the Nixon administration launched an effort to deport him, citing legal grounds. For 4 years, John fought a long legal battle against the Immigration Department, which refused to grant him permanent U.S. residency. In the middle of that conflict, the couple released Sometime in New York City in 1972, in collaboration with the band Elephant's Memory. The double album functioned as a political manifesto, tackling women's rights, racism, the British occupation of Northern Ireland, and even John's own fight for a green card. The record, however, was a commercial failure and drew criticism for its heavy-handed, pamphlet-like tone. The British press was especially harsh. Magazine NME published an open letter from Tony Tyler, calling John a pathetic, aging revolutionary. In the U.S., controversy centered on the track Woman is the Nigger of the World. Its provocative title sparked backlash and led several radio stations to ban the song outright. Despite the pushback, John and Yoko stayed the course, organizing 2 benefit concerts to support patients at the Willowbrook State School, a psychiatric institution. The concerts, held on August 30th, 1972, at Madison Square Garden, featured Elephant's Memory, alongside several guest performers. It would turn out to be the last full concert John Lennon would ever give. After progressive candidate George McGovern lost the presidential election, a candidate John had supported, the couple attended an event at activist Jerry Rubin's home. The night ended badly. A drunk John cheated on Yoko with one of the guests. The episode shook their relationship. Yoko later channeled the pain into art, composing Death of Samantha, inspired directly by the betrayal. In 1973, while preparing Mind Games, John and Yoko decided to separate. What followed were 18 months of parties, alcohol, and chaos. John moved in with May Pang, his assistant. During this period, he grew close to musicians like Harry Nilsson, best known for Coconut, and the song many remember from the video game Grand Theft Auto Vice City, referenced here as the actual title mentioned, Alan Wake. John's behavior became fodder for tabloids. Both he and Nilsson, wild and unrestrained, drew attention wherever they went. In March, 2 incidents at the Troubadour Club scandalized the media. In the first, John showed up with a sanitary napkin taped to his forehead and got into an altercation with a waitress. 2 weeks later, he was thrown out alongside Nilsson for heckling the Smothers Brothers during their set. During this period, John produced Harry Nilsson's album Pussycats in Los Angeles. But the chaos took its toll on the recording sessions. After weeks of disorder, John and May returned to New York to try to finish the project with sharper focus. Around the same time, John also produced Too Many Cooks Spoil the Soup for Mick Jagger. Contractual issues delayed its release until 2007. Back in New York, John found some measure of balance amid the creative chaos. He contributed to several successful recordings, including the single Number 9 Dream. One of the most memorable moments of this period came during an Elton John concert at Madison Square Garden, when John joined his friend on stage to perform together. By this point, he and Yoko were already in the process of reconciling. He also collaborated with David Bowie on the track Fame, which became a hit in the United States. He followed that with the single Stand By Me, which performed well in both the US and UK, his last major hit for a long stretch of time. In April 1975, John decided to step away from performing altogether. He did it in grand fashion during the recording of the TV special A Salute to Lou Grade, broadcast on ATV. He played guitar backed by an 8-piece band wearing masks, an ironic gesture aimed at the organizers, whom he viewed as two-faced. His performance of Stand By Me was cut from the broadcast, but by then, John had already accomplished what he'd set out to do. After years in the spotlight, he decided to disappear, at least for a while. Far from the studios and the pressures of fame, he traded guitar chords for the kitchen, applause for the cries of a newborn. The birth of John Lennon on October 9th, 1975, the very same day John turned 35, marked the start of an entirely new chapter. From then on, he devoted himself fully to fatherhood, waking at 6 each morning, preparing meals, spending his days with his son, discovering the small joys of a domestic routine he'd never known before. For the first time, he seemed completely absorbed in private life. Even so, creativity never disappeared. In 1976, he wrote Cookin' in the Kitchen of Love for Ringo Starr's album Ringo's Rotogravure, and took part in its recording that June. In 1977, during a trip to Japan, he spoke openly about the hiatus, saying that he and Yoko had made a simple decision to spend as much time as possible with Sean. According to John, the couple felt they needed to focus fully on family before making room to create anything beyond that. During this voluntary retreat, John also devoted himself more freely to art, sketching, drafting story ideas, and beginning work on a book blending autobiographical accounts with what he called crazy stuff, daydreams put to paper. John Lennon seemed more at peace than ever, and for the first time, he wasn't chasing peace for the world. He was chasing peace for himself. After years away, John Lennon announced his return in October 1980 with the single Just Like Starting Over. The inspiration came from a trip he took that June when he decided to sail to Bermuda. Midway through the journey, a storm hit the boat. The crew struggled, but John took the helm himself and steered the vessel safely through. The experience reignited his creativity. In the weeks that followed, he stayed in Bermuda, writing Double Fantasy, a deeply personal album reflecting the inner peace he'd finally found. The album and single, however, weren't especially well received. John and Yoko then began working on a new project, Milk and Honey, a project that would be cut short by tragedy. On the cold night of December 8th, 1980, New York was wrapped in the typical late autumn chill. Storefronts decorated for the season, distant sirens, hurried taxis. Among the pedestrians, a man walked along clutching a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He'd read the book and, like its protagonist, Holden Caulfield, felt disillusioned with the world. His deepest frustration centered on John Lennon, the artist who preached peace, but who, in his eyes, was just another hypocrite. In the pocket of his coat, this man, 25-year-old Mark David Chapman, carried a .38 caliber revolver. Earlier that day, Mark had asked John for an autograph on a copy of Double Fantasy. The singer signed it kindly. Mark smiled and posed for a photo. Hours later, he returned to the Dakota, where John lived with Yoko and their son. The man waited outside for 2 hours until he saw John step through the door. Before we dive into what happened, it's worth taking a closer look at the man behind it. Mark David Chapman was born on May 10th, 1955, in Fort Worth, Texas. He grew up in a household marked by tension. His father, a military man, was cold and authoritarian. His mother tried to shield him however she could. From an early age, Mark felt out of place. Bright but withdrawn, he retreated into an imaginary world, invented fictional friends, and found refuge in Beatles records. But the boy who once loved music began to change. Fell into drug use. He dropped out of school, attempted suicide, and was hospitalized. He later converted to Christianity, preaching fervently, often shouting about the end of days. Even so, the anger and confusion never fully left him. Something explosive kept building inside. Mark wanted to be remembered. He craved significance. And when he read The Catcher in the Rye, he fixated on Holden Caulfield. the rebellious young man raging against phonies. Mark grew obsessed with the character, gradually reshaping his own identity around that worldview. And in his mind, he made a twisted connection. John Lennon was one of the phonies. To him, John was no longer the boy from Liverpool, but a symbol of the very hypocrisy Holden despised. Over the following months, Mark planned the crime, traveling to New York more than once. At times, he considered giving up entirely, but the obsession won out. He returned to the city convinced he was on a divine mission, carrying the book with him like a personal Bible. On the morning of December 8th, Mark Chapman arrived at the Dakota and watched John Lennon leave for a recording session at the studio. He approached with an album in hand and asked for an autograph. John signed it calmly, with no idea that in his attacker's mind, that moment was part of a symbolic farewell. Hours later, around 10:50 that night, John returned to the building with Yoko. The couple was in high spirits, having just finished recording Walking on Thin Ice. They crossed the lobby. Mark stepped out of the shadows and fired 5 shots. 2 struck John in the back. 2 more hit his shoulder. He managed a few more steps before collapsing to the ground. Yoko screamed, and the doorman called the police. Meanwhile, Mark stayed at the scene, sitting down on the sidewalk and calmly reading The Catcher in the Rye, as if the blood spreading across the ground meant nothing to him. John was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 11:15 p.m. During questioning, Mark insisted he hadn't killed out of personal hatred. He seemed genuinely convinced he'd carried out an act of justice. He wanted to destroy the symbol John represented and, in his mind, absorb his fame in the process. In his own words, "I killed John Lennon because he was too famous, and I was nobody." His defense attorney planned to argue insanity, but Mark refused, choosing instead to plead guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility. Since then, he's applied for parole multiple times, every request denied. Mark claims he's found remorse and rediscovered his faith, but to the world, he remains unforgiven. After all, he killed a man who wrote and sang anthems of peace, a man who, despite battling his own inner conflicts throughout his life, had finally found a measure of serenity and was trying to share that peace with the world. The day after the tragedy, Yoko Ono announced there would be no funeral, only a silent vigil. She asked fans and friends to pray for John and, instead of flowers, to make donations to the Spirit Foundation, an organization he'd founded. John's remains were cremated. His ashes were scattered across Central Park, where, years later, the Strawberry Fields Memorial would rise, forever marking his presence at the heart of the city. John Lennon spent much of his life trying to transform his own inner chaos into a message of global peace. And even surrounded by controversy, he inspired millions to imagine a better world. Perhaps the most striking thing about him is this: John was too human to fit the mold of a saintly pacifist. His actions and statements revealed a man in constant conflict with his own ego, his past, and even his own ideals. He spoke of universal love, yet carried a history of aggression. He championed peace, yet expressed open contempt for authority and institutions. He was, without question, contradictory, and precisely because of that, entirely real. John's philosophy centered on something direct. He didn't want people to simply sing "Imagine." He wanted them to reflect. What if there really were no borders, no religion, no possessions? What would it mean to live in a world where peace was more than just a talking point? That restlessness fueled his art. He wasn't an artist who merely sang about flowers. He was someone trying to make sense of his own existence and sharing that process with the world. His relationship with Yoko was part of that same journey. Together, they turned love into protest. Of course, both faced criticism, were canceled, as we might say today, and accused of hypocrisy. But John Lennon never tried to appear perfect. He was unstable, intense, sometimes incoherent, and yet, somehow, through all that chaos, he conveyed something that struck deep in anyone who listened: hope. His death in 1980 sent shockwaves through pop culture. Era's most provocative and sincere voices had suddenly been switched off. To John Lennon, peace didn't begin with governments or treaties. In his view, change began within every human being. Curiously, Mark Chapman was himself a deeply troubled man, someone who had never found his own inner peace, and whose darkness led him to commit something terrible. In a strange way, perhaps that proved John Lennon's point all along, that new treaties and government reforms mean nothing if the individuals within a society remain sick, lost, wandering in their own darkness.